In the summer of 1665, a bolt of cloth arrived in the quiet English village of Eyam, damp, flea-infested, and carrying death. Within days, the plague had taken hold. Panic spread, and escape seemed the only hope. But instead of fleeing, the villagers made an extraordinary choice. They sealed themselves in. Led by two clergymen, Eyam entered a self-imposed quarantine, cutting off all contact with the outside world. For 14 months, they buried their own dead, worshipped in open fields, and left coins in vinegar at boundary stones to buy supplies. Over 260 lives were lost, but the plague never spread beyond their borders. What drives a community to sacrifice itself for strangers? And what legacy did Eyam leave behind in the history of courage? Nestled within the rugged folds of Derbyshire's Peak District, the village of Eyam appears, at first glance, unremarkable. A scattering of stone cottages, fields that rise and fall in green waves, and a parish church whose bell once marked the rhythms of village life. Yet history has elevated Eyam beyond its modest geography, for here, in the year 1665, a community made a decision so profound that it etched their name into the annals of human courage. They chose, in the face of death, to seal themselves off from the outside world, accepting sacrifice so that others might live. This was no grand city with resources or armies to enforce quarantine. Eyam was a small settlement, no more than 800 souls, clinging to survival in an age when disease was a constant companion. But it was here that the Great Plague of London found an unexpected foothold, carried not by invading soldiers or ambitious merchants, but by something far more mundane, a parcel of cloth. The 17th century was an age haunted by pestilence. Plague had stalked Europe for centuries, flaring in unpredictable bursts, cutting down rich and poor alike. The memory of the Black Death lingered like a shadow, and each new outbreak rekindled fear. London's streets teemed with infection in 1665, its mortality mounting so quickly that death carts rolled daily through alleys, collecting bodies like refuse. Eyam, a village over 100 miles north, must have seemed at first safely remote. Yet commerce carried peril as effectively as armies, and the cloth that arrived at the home of the local tailor, George Vicars, bore more than fabric. Hidden in its folds, likely among damp wool where they thrived, were plague-infested fleas. When Vicars unwrapped the parcel, he unleashed more than a shipment. He unleashed fate. Within days he fell ill, feverish, with buboes swelling grotesquely on his body, the telltale signature of Yersinia pestis. His death was swift, and in the tight-knit lanes of Eyam, whispers of plague spread as quickly as infection. Neighbors who had touched the cloth, children who had played near the house, villagers who had gathered in casual intimacy, each became vulnerable. What had seemed a village far from London's misery was suddenly an echo of it, its cottages transformed into silent tombs. The reaction was, at first, as human as it was desperate. Families sought to flee, to carry their loved ones into the hills where clean air might protect them. Fear not at solidarity, for to remain was to risk contagion. Yet as the disease advanced, a radical thought began to take hold. What if their escape meant not salvation, but doom for others? The people of Eyam, in their flight, could become carriers, sowing death in surrounding villages, perhaps across the Shire. To save themselves might condemn hundreds, even thousands more. It was at this crossroads that Eyam's destiny crystallized. Under the leadership of their rector, William Mompesson, and with the aid of his predecessor, Thomas Stanley, the villagers began to discuss a grim possibility, that they should not flee at all, that Eyam should seal itself off, accepting whatever suffering lay ahead, in order to halt the plague's advance. This was not merely resignation, it was sacrifice, born of a collective conscience rarely seen in times of terror. To choose to stay was to choose death, for plague spared no one by status or piety. Yet in the minds of Mompesson and Stanley, and eventually in the hearts of Eyam's people, the moral weight tipped toward containment. Better that Eyam perish than the plague spread. Such a decision was unprecedented. Cities sometimes locked their gates, nobles sometimes abandoned their peasants. But for an entire village voluntarily to imprison itself with a disease was extraordinary. It was not a choice made easily. Villagers argued, mourned, and feared. Mothers begged to protect their children. Farmers worried about their fields, and the young resented the loss of futures yet unlived. But gradually, a shared conviction emerged, strengthened by the persuasive sermons of Maupassant, who spoke not only of Christian duty but of practical survival. If they contained the plague, at least others would be spared, and God might see their sacrifice as an act of communal virtue. And so, the village of Eyam sealed itself. No one would leave, no outsider would enter. Stones marked the boundaries, where goods might be exchanged without contact. Coins were left soaking in vinegar, believed to cleanse them of contagion, while food and supplies were left at agreed-upon points. The village, once woven into the rhythms of the wider world, became an island of death. Within its boundaries, plague would rage unchecked, and the villagers knew they had condemned themselves to its fury. Yet there was dignity in the decision. It was an act of solidarity rare in human history, one that lifted Eyam from obscurity. The people had chosen to confront plague not with denial or selfishness, but with sacrifice, preserving others at the cost of themselves. The story of Eyam would echo centuries later, when new pandemics emerged, as an example of how ordinary people could act with extraordinary courage. But in the summer of 1665, they were not yet martyrs or legends. They were frightened men, women, and children, trapped within stone cottages, watching as one by one neighbors fell, friends disappeared, and the silence of death spread through their lanes. The banishment of escape did not eliminate fear, it magnified it. And as the plague's grip tightened, Eyam became not just a village but a crucible, where humanity itself would be tested against suffering. The stage was set for one of the most harrowing chapters in English history, where sacrifice and sorrow would intertwine. Eyam had chosen its path, but now it would walk it step by step, burial by burial, prayer by prayer, until the last ember of plague burned itself out. In that crucible of loss, the true measure of Eyam's sacrifice would be revealed. In late August of 1665, a parcel arrived at the modest cottage of George Vickers, a tailor who had come to Eyam seeking work and stability. Eyam was no bustling city, yet even here fashion and fabric tied the village to the wider commercial world. Cloth came from London, that vast and fevered capital, where merchants trafficked in silks, woolens, and linens for customers scattered across the English countryside. For George, the arrival of such a bundle was no rarity, merely part of his trade. He unwrapped it as he had unwrapped dozens before, unaware that this parcel carried within it the seeds of catastrophe. The cloth had come damp, whether by rain during transit or by careless storage in London's warehouses. Its folds had grown moist, an ideal nesting ground for fleas. Within those fleas dwelt the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the microscopic agent of plague. Carried innocently along roads and rivers, packed away with bolts of fabric, they crossed miles unseen. In the quiet stone house of a tailor in Eyam, they awoke into deadly action. Vickers himself was the first to fall. He sickened with alarming speed, fever burning his body, chills racking his limbs, and most horrifying of all, the swellings, buboes, blackened and agonizing, bulging in the creases of his body. The villagers had seen illness before, but this was unmistakable. Whispers rippled through the narrow lanes. The plague, the same plague that stalked London. Vickers lingered for days in pain before succumbing. His body was hurriedly buried, yet even in the act of burial, neighbors risked exposure. Fear spread with his death. Families who had visited the cottage, children who had run errands for the tailor, friends who had touched the cloth, all feared that invisible death now clung to them. The first circle of contagion had been drawn, and it would widen inexorably. Vickers' home stood like a cursed marker within the village, a place no one dared to enter. Yet the fleas, carried on the clothing, on the bodies of those who had been near him, already roamed further. The plague had arrived in Eyam not with trumpet or proclamation, but with the humdrum arrival of a parcel. It was a bitter irony. The village had no fortifications to repel an enemy army, yet no battlements could have stopped what that bundle carried. Death had slipped past unnoticed, disguised as trade. The line between survival and disaster had been crossed by something as ordinary as commerce itself. In the weeks that followed, Vickers' death was only the beginning. Other villagers fell sick. A child here, a servant there, the illness leaping unpredictably from household to household. Some succumbed within days, others lingered in agony. In every case, the pattern was unmistakable: fever, swellings, delirium, death. The fear was suffocating. People avoided their neighbors, shut themselves in, prayed with desperation. Yet the plague seeped through walls and closed doors. London had been ravaged by plague for months already, its mortality terrifying in scale. In some weeks, thousands died, the toll recorded with grim efficiency in the city's bills of mortality. But in Eyam, numbers were smaller and therefore crueler. Each death was not one among thousands, but one among friends. The villagers knew each other intimately. Each grave dug was for a face known, a voice remembered. The psychological toll was immense. What had once been daily rhythms of rural life, the toll of the church bell, the chatter in the market, the laughter of children, was replaced by silence punctured only by grief. The churchyard began to fill, and those digging graves understood that more would soon be needed. Fearful whispers spread. Perhaps they should flee. Perhaps if they abandoned the village, they might outrun death. Neighboring towns still stood healthy. The hills seemed to beckon with safety. Yet as the contagion spread, a deeper awareness dawned. If they fled, they risked carrying the plague with them. The parcel that had come from London had infected Eyam. Now Eyam itself might become the parcel that infected the Midlands. And with this realization, a terrible moral weight began to press upon the community. Still, at this stage, their fate was undecided. The rector, William Mompesson, had not yet delivered his appeal for quarantine. Thomas Stanley, his Puritan predecessor, had not yet lent his stern support. In these first weeks, Eyam existed in uncertainty, with some preparing to escape and others clinging to prayer. Death seemed inevitable, and the villagers had not yet grasped that their true trial was not only to endure the plague, but to choose how they would endure it. The tailor's parcel had been the spark. The fire was spreading. The question was no longer whether Eyam was afflicted, but how the village would respond, in selfishness and flight, or in sacrifice and containment. Their answer would come, but not yet. For now, the memory of George Vickers' agonized death loomed over the village like a prophecy. What had arrived with cloth would not leave until it had remade Eyam forever. When George Vickers was laid in the earth, the bells of St. Lawrence Church tolled solemnly, their mournful sound drifting across the limestone hills. Yet the villagers of Eyam were not only burying a tailor, they were burying the illusion of safety. The plague had reached them, and from that moment onward, life in the village shifted into a tense vigil, haunted by dread that could not be seen but only felt in the fevers and buboes that sprouted like grotesque harvests on the human body. The first deaths after Vickers seemed to follow swiftly, as if the disease had been waiting patiently to burst forth. Children, servants, and housewives were the earliest victims. Their families, bewildered and desperate, tried everything within their understanding. They bled the sick with crude instruments, applied poultices of herbs, prayed aloud in candlelit cottages, and burned pungent fires in hopes that smoke might cleanse the air. None of it availed them. The pestilence ignored charms and remedies, moving with merciless rhythm from one door to the next. Fear took shape in whispers. Should we leave? Neighbors asked each other in hushed tones. For centuries, flight had been the instinctive response to plague. The wealthy in London had already fled to country estates when the death toll in the city soared. But Eyam was no seat of privilege. Here, departure was no simple matter. Families were tied to their land, to their livestock, to their neighbors. Abandonment was a heavy choice. Yet the fear was so consuming that some did indeed pack their belongings and escape into the hills. Stories tell of cottages left half-filled, bread still on tables, hearths still smoldering, as families vanished before nightfall. The exodus was not universal. Others hesitated, torn between dread and duty. Some feared that flight was pointless. If God's hand had marked Eyam for punishment, then no valley or distant town would shield them. Others stayed out of obligation, unwilling to abandon relatives too weak to move. And some simply lacked the means. Poverty anchored them to their stone walls, leaving them to face plague head-on. By autumn of 1665, the infection had gained a dreadful momentum. Graves multiplied in the churchyard, their markers crudely carved by trembling hands. Entire households began to vanish from the rolls of the living. The Hancock family of Riley Farm, for example, would lose 6 children in rapid succession, their mother digging graves herself, unable to rely on neighbors who feared contagion. Such acts of solitary burial became common, for the living dreaded drawing near the dead. In Eyam, grief was private, sealed behind doors. The atmosphere of the village grew tense, marked by suspicion as much as sorrow. Each cough, each feverish look, was scrutinized. People avoided gatherings. The once busy and fell silent. Even the church services dwindled, for few dared to crowd indoors. Fear fractured trust. Where once there had been laughter in meadows and fellowship in markets, there now lay silence, broken only by weeping or the sound of spades striking earth. The clergy recognized the growing panic. Rector William Mompesson, though young and recently appointed, was already envisioning a path forward. His conviction grew that Eyam's fate must be confronted as a community, not as scattered individuals. Yet his vision was not yet shared. Many still hoped to flee, reasoning that self-preservation outweighed all else. Without guidance, Eyam risked collapse into chaos, some fleeing, some staying, none united. Meanwhile, the numbers rose. Eyam's population was only about 800, yet by late 1665, dozens had perished. For London, where weekly burials numbered in the thousands, this might seem small. But for Eyam, it was devastating. Each new grave was not anonymous. It belonged to a neighbor, a godparent, a fellow laborer in the fields. In such an intimate community, every death tore at the collective fabric. The psychological toll became unbearable, and still the disease pressed on. Winter brought no reprieve. While plague often waned in cold months, Eyam's tightly clustered cottages provided warmth for fleas and their hidden bacterium. The death cart was never needed, for there were always enough grieving hands to carry bodies, but the rhythm of funerals seemed relentless. Bells tolled so often that they lost their distinction, becoming part of the very air of the village. As the first wave of fear swept Eyam, the villagers stood on the brink of an unprecedented decision. They could scatter, carrying the plague into neighboring towns, or they could contain themselves within their valley, accepting near-certain death for the sake of others. It was a choice that would test the boundaries of human courage, faith, and despair. For now, fear reigned, and the memory of Vickers' parcel loomed as a grim reminder that the most ordinary of things could carry the weight of destiny. The first wave of fear had passed, but Eyam's true trial was yet to begin. In the spring of 1666, as the plague's grip tightened, the village would face the moment that defined its place in history, to flee or to sacrifice. By the winter of 1665, the people of Eyam were exhausted. Fear had become their daily bread, grief their constant companion. The village that once hummed with simple, pastoral rhythms now resembled a silent, watchful camp where death hovered at every door. Into this atmosphere of despair and confusion stepped William Mompesson, the young rector, whose arrival in Eyam only a year earlier had been marked by suspicion rather than welcome. Now, unexpectedly, he would become the voice that sought to hold a disintegrating village together. Mompesson was only in his late 20s, recently appointed to Eyam, and his background as an Anglican clergyman already set him apart from many of his parishioners. A portion of the village still looked to his Puritan predecessor, Thomas Stanley, for moral guidance. Stanley had been removed during the turbulent years following the English Civil War, but he remained in Eyam, a figure of quiet influence. Mompesson, meanwhile, was viewed by some as an outsider, a man with ties to authority rather than to the rugged independence of the villagers. His youth, his connections, and his theological stance all made him suspect in the eyes of those who remembered the old ways. Yet crisis has a way of reshaping loyalties. As the plague tightened its grip, it became clear that no ordinary measures would suffice. Families were debating flight, roads were filling with travelers from infected towns, and the surrounding villages were growing wary of Eyam's presence. If Eyam fractured into scattered households fleeing into Derbyshire, the plague would not only continue but spread further afield, devastating the entire region. Someone had to articulate the unthinkable, that the people of Eyam should stay where they were, locking themselves within their valley, even at the cost of their lives. It was Mompesson who found the courage to propose it. In early 1666, he began to speak openly about the moral burden they carried. He reminded the villagers that the plague had arrived by commerce, from London to Eyam through the tailor's parcel. If they fled, they would become another parcel, carrying contagion into other communities. Would they, as Christians, lay such guilt upon themselves? Would they, by seeking to save their own bodies, condemn others to die? His sermons, though somber, were delivered with growing fire. He spoke of sacrifice, of the duty to neighbor, of the higher calling to prevent the spread of suffering even when no earthly reward was promised. Maupassant did not stand alone. Though theological rivals, he sought the counsel of Thomas Stanley, the Puritan who remained respected among dissenters in Eyam. In one of history's rare instances where old enmities gave way to necessity, the Anglican rector and the Puritan minister found common ground. They agreed that the village must stay sealed, and together they spoke with one voice. Their unity lent the proposal a weight it might otherwise have lacked, for between them they commanded the spiritual trust of nearly every soul in Eyam. The decision to quarantine was radical. No law required it. No royal decree demanded it. This was not a top-down imposition, but a choice forged in the crucible of communal conscience. It was, in many ways, an act of radical self-sacrifice unparalleled in 17th-century England. To stay was to invite death. To flee was to spread it. The choice was stark, yet Maupassant framed it as a test of Christian duty. He invoked the image of Christ's sacrifice, urging the villagers to see in their suffering a reflection of divine love. By remaining, they might save countless lives in the surrounding shires. By leaving, they might doom them. The message was not embraced easily. Families wept, protested, argued. Some pointed to children too young to understand the fate being chosen for them. Others asked if God had truly commanded such a thing, or whether this was madness disguised as piety. Yet Maupassant persisted. Patiently, he met with households, explaining the logic, urging faith. He reminded them that the world was watching, that Eyam's actions would ripple beyond their valley. Slowly, agonizingly, the tide of opinion shifted. By the spring of 1666, the decision had crystallized. Eyam would remain sealed. A quarantine boundary was established, marked by stones around the perimeter of the village. Beyond these boundary stones, no villager would pass. Arrangements were made with nearby communities. Food and supplies would be left at agreed-upon points, and in exchange, coins soaked in vinegar, believed to purify, would be left in payment. The people of Eyam had effectively walled themselves into a prison of their own making, with death as their likely jailer. This act was not carried out in blind fanaticism. It was debated, resisted, mourned. But once chosen, it was embraced with a grim resolve. The unity between Maupassant and Stanley, rare in an era so defined by religious division, gave the decision its moral backbone. The villagers, from the wealthiest landholder to the humblest laborer, accepted their fate together. Their choice was no longer merely about survival, but about honor, faith, and the sanctity of others' lives. The quarantine transformed Eyam from a victim of plague into a community defined by sacrifice. The villagers, though terrified, understood that history itself would judge them by what they chose to do. And in choosing isolation, they became something more than a plague-ridden village. They became an emblem of selflessness in a world too often driven by self-preservation. The voice of the rector had been heard, not because it promised salvation in this life, but because it acknowledged suffering and gave it meaning. For Maupassant, this was not leadership won by age or prestige, but by the sheer gravity of truth. There was no other way. From this moment forward, Eyam was no longer merely enduring the plague. It was shaping its own destiny, deliberately stepping into the fire so that the flames would not spread. The decision had been made, and with it came a task both practical and symbolic, to draw the boundary of Eyam's living grave. If the village was to quarantine itself, it had to define the lines that no one could cross. This was not just a measure of public health. It was a ritual of surrender and defiance, a pact with death and with the outside world. Once the stones were placed, there would be no turning back. The landscape around Eyam offered natural boundaries, ridges and valleys that had for centuries defined pastures, fields, and paths. But now, those familiar contours took on a new meaning. Villagers carried stones, heavy and cold, and set them at points along the perimeter, often where footpaths led out of the settlement. Each stone marked not just geography, but destiny. Beyond this point lay freedom and safety, but for Eyam's people, crossing it was forbidden. At several of these points, holes were carved into the stone surface. Into those hollowed spaces, villagers would later pour vinegar to soak coins, their strange commerce with the outside world. Vinegar was believed to purify, to kill invisible corruption. In that simple act of barter, goods left in exchange for disinfected money, the lifeline of Eyam would be maintained. The villagers approached this grim labor with solemnity. Whole families walked to the edges of their world, their children carrying smaller rocks, their elders leaning on staffs. It was a communal rite, as if by shaping their prison with their own hands they could give meaning to the fate imposed upon them. For some, tears flowed freely as they placed the stones, knowing that they had sealed not only the paths of the living, but also the routes by which they might have escaped. Yet there was also a strange pride, for in marking these boundaries they claimed their destiny, refusing to become agents of wider destruction. Around the perimeter, certain spots became charged with special significance. At Mompesson's Well, a natural spring beyond the edge of the village, supplies from neighboring towns would later be left in exchange for payment. There, villagers would collect food, grain, bread, meat, sometimes even luxuries sent in compassion by wealthier neighbors. The well, already a source of life through its waters, now became a conduit between the quarantined and the free. Each trip to it was an act of courage and faith, for it meant trusting the outside world not to abandon them. The boundary stones themselves carried an air of the sacred. They were mute, cold, unyielding, yet villagers began to treat them as if they were guardians. Children were warned never to cross them, to treat them with reverence as though angels or spirits watched over the invisible wall. In truth, those stones became the gravestones of freedom, marking the invisible line between life and death, hope and despair. Inside the boundary, life changed swiftly. Markets were abandoned, journeys to nearby villages ceased, weddings were postponed, and only funerals continued, multiplied until they nearly consumed the community. The stones reminded the people daily that they were alone, that no aid but God's hand and human mercy from afar would sustain them. For the outside world, the stones were both a reassurance and a warning. Eyam had contained itself. If others respected the markers, the plague would not leap beyond them. Not everyone embraced the decision with equal serenity. Some still whispered of escape, arguing that to remain was folly, that duty to one's own children outweighed all appeals to the welfare of strangers. But the majority yielded to the collective will. The unity forged between William Mompesson and Thomas Stanley gave the decision spiritual gravity that outweighed private doubt. To cross the boundary now was not just disobedience. It was betrayal, both of God and of neighbor. The villagers devised methods for survival within their stone prison. Fields within the boundary still needed tending, and livestock still demanded care. These tasks continued, though often interrupted by sickness and grief. Communal worship was moved outdoors, to Cucklet Delph, a natural amphitheater where families could gather at safe distances, avoiding the stifling air of the church where infection might lurk. Mompesson would preach there, his voice echoing across limestone walls, carrying words of consolation and conviction. Worship beneath the sky became both a necessity and a symbol of their altered life. Faith unbounded by walls, yet bounded by disease. The boundary stones remained silent witnesses. They saw no soldiers guarding them, no chains or fences. Only the villager's conscience held them within. This self-imposed obedience was itself extraordinary in an age when flight was the instinctive response to plague. In larger towns, the wealthy had already escaped to country manners, leaving the poor to fend for themselves. Yet here, in Eyam, a village of farmers and tradespeople, the people bound themselves to a common fate. And so Eyam became an island, surrounded not by seas, but by stone and resolve. Those who lived within accepted that they were, in a sense, already buried, alive, but cut off from the wider world. Their valley transformed into a sepulchre where the living awaited their turn among the dead. But in that grim isolation, there also emerged a strange strength. By choosing boundaries, they had chosen honor. By placing stones, they had placed meaning. And though they trembled with fear and loss, they began to see themselves not as victims alone, but as guardians of others' lives. The stones stood as testament. Eyam would die, but Eyam would not kill. The summer of 1666 descended upon Eyam with an unnatural stillness, as though even the birds hesitated to sing over a village marked for death. The meadows bloomed in wild flowers, the fields shimmered in the heat, and sheep grazed on the limestone hillsides. To an outsider, the valley might have seemed a pastoral paradise untouched by the troubles of the world. But within Eyam's stone cottages, the plague advanced with merciless pace, and the quiet of the landscape became a cruel contrast to the cries of the dying. It was during these months that the true weight of quarantine settled upon the villagers. The decision made in spring was now binding in ways both practical and emotional. Families who had once debated leaving had reconciled themselves to their fate. The boundary stones stood in their silent vigil, and few dared even to glance at them with longing. Instead, the people turned inward, their world shrinking to the confines of narrow lanes and smoke-filled hearths. To walk through Eyam in those days was to wander through a place at once alive and already ghostly. The heat of summer did nothing to slow the pestilence. Instead, it seemed to amplify its horrors. Corpses decayed too quickly, forcing burials to be rushed. In some cases, families could not wait for help. They dug graves in their own gardens and laid their loved ones to rest with no witnesses but the sparrows and the watching sky. One mother, Elizabeth Hancock, buried her husband and 6 of her children with her own hands, lowering them into the earth one by one, for no one else dared to come near. Stories like hers multiplied, each a testament to both the devastation and the grim resilience of the villagers. The rhythm of life became a rhythm of death. Mompesson recorded funerals in his parish register, sometimes several on a single day. He wrote with a hand that must have trembled, knowing each name was more than ink. It was a neighbor, a friend, a member of his shrinking flock. Stanley, though outside the official parish roll, continued to comfort the afflicted, walking from cottage to cottage with the bravery of a man who had already surrendered his life to God's service. Together, the 2 clergymen became twin beacons in the storm, one Anglican, one Puritan, yet united by plague and by the need to shepherd Eyam through its darkest hour. The silence of the village was punctuated only by groans, weeping, and the toll of the church bell. The bell became a language of its own, announcing to all that another household had fallen. It rang so often that its voice lost the sharpness of tragedy and became the steady drone of inevitability. Children grew up in those months knowing no lullabies but the tolling for the dead. The air itself seemed weighted with sorrow, thick with the knowledge that at any moment fever could strike in one's own home. Daily tasks became rituals of survival. Food from outside was collected at the boundary stones or at Mompesson's well, where neighbors from surrounding villages left supplies in exchange for disinfected coins. Vinegar-filled crevices in the stones became symbols of fragile hope, that necessity could still be met, that some connection with the outside remained. Each trip to collect provisions was both a lifeline and a reminder of exile. Eyam's people could receive aid, but they could never again walk freely into the towns they once visited. Yet amid the silence, there were flickers of extraordinary courage. Some villagers took on roles no one else dared. Gravediggers risked exposure with each burial. Caregivers moved from cottage to cottage, tending to the stricken though they knew it was likely a death sentence. Mothers nursed their fevered children, refusing to abandon them even as contagion seeped into their own bodies. Acts of compassion carried a terrible cost, but they illuminated the moral choice Eyam had made. They would die, but they would not abandon one another. Outside Eyam, the world continued largely unaware. In London, the Great Fire raged in that same year, reducing vast swaths of the city to ash. While Londoners rebuilt with brick and stone, Eyam withered in obscurity. News traveled slowly, and though nearby villages marveled at Eyam's quarantine, the broader nation scarcely paused to notice. The villagers of Eyam bore their sacrifice without witness or applause, their heroism hidden beneath the limestone hills. By late summer, the death toll was staggering. Entire families disappeared, their cottages left empty, their gardens overgrown. The streets that had once echoed with chatter now seemed haunted, every door a possible threshold to a plague house. Fear no longer surged in waves as it had in the early months. Instead, it became a steady undertone of life, like the background hum of sorrow itself. And yet, paradoxically, the silence of summer also deepened faith. Outdoor sermons at Delft drew the survivors together. They stood apart for safety, yet their voices joined in hymns that rose into the air, a fragile defiance against despair. Maupassant's sermons urged them not to measure their suffering in numbers, but to see it as sacrifice, an offering that spared the lives of countless others beyond their valley. Stanley, too, spoke with fervor, reminding them that martyrdom was not only the fate of saints in faraway lands, but could be found in humble English villages, in the act of choosing to remain when all instinct cried to flee. The summer passed, leaving behind no triumph, only a thinning population and a mounting ledger of the dead. But within the silence lay seeds of meaning. Eyam was transforming itself, by slow agony, into a symbol of moral courage. Though the villagers could not yet see it, their choice would echo through centuries, long after the fields had been sown again and the cottages repaired. In that silent summer, Eyam became both tomb and testimony, a place where death reigned supreme, but also where human resolve held firm against the terror of plague. By the autumn of 1666, Eyam had ceased to resemble a living village. Its cottages stood like stone shells, their windows shuttered, their gardens untended, and its lanes emptied of laughter and trade. To walk the narrow paths between the houses was to move through a place suspended between life and death, where the living clung to faith even as mortality pressed closer with each passing week. This was the season in which faith itself became both weapon and burden, the only shield the villagers had left against despair. William Maupassant, though only in his late 20s, bore a weight greater than men twice his age. The parish register he kept became a grim chronicle, line upon line of names struck down by plague. He buried his own wife, Catherine, in those months, and though he wrote little of his grief, the silence of his entries spoke volumes. Her death was not only a personal tragedy, but also a public symbol. If even the rector's household could not be spared, then the plague was no respecter of station. Yet Maupassant did not retreat into mourning. Instead, he threw himself deeper into the work of guiding his flock, speaking with a fervor that drew strength from the very abyss of his loss. Thomas Stanley, his Puritan counterpart, shared the burden, though his theology was sterner, his sermons woven with warnings of divine judgment alongside comfort for the dying. Together they formed an unlikely partnership, Anglican and Puritan, once divided by civil strife, now united by a common enemy that scorned all denominational lines. The plague had stripped away their differences, leaving only their shared duty to shepherd the souls of Eyam. The toll of faith was visible in every act of worship. At Delft, the limestone outcrop that served as their open-air church, the villagers gathered still, though spaced apart on the grassy slopes. There, with the wind carrying their hymns, they found strength to endure. The open air was safer than the close walls of St. Lawrence, but it was also symbolic, a reminder that faith was larger than buildings, that the divine could be invoked under sky and stone as easily as within carved pews. Each sermon carried both consolation and challenge, urging the people to remain steadfast in their quarantine, to see their suffering as an act of sacrificial love for strangers beyond the hills. But faith came at a cost. It demanded endurance beyond what flesh could easily bear. Families who prayed fervently still lost children by the week. Neighbors who recited psalms over sickbeds still buried their kin by dawn. Some began to question whether God had abandoned Eyam, whether the plague was not a test, but a punishment too severe to comprehend. Doubt crept like a second contagion, unspoken but heavy in the air. The clergy recognized this and responded in kind. Maupassant preached of Job, who endured calamity without losing faith. Stanley invoked the early Christians, who faced lions and pyres for their beliefs. In their rhetoric, Eyam's villagers became martyrs not by sword or fire, but by voluntary isolation. Their suffering, they insisted, was not meaningless. It was the price of sparing others, a form of sanctity born in anonymity. This narrative sustained many, though it could not erase the raw grief of empty beds and silenced laughter. The toll of faith was also physical. Ministers visited plague houses, praying at bedsides where fever burned, offering the sacrament to trembling lips. They did so knowing that every touch, every breath shared in those close quarters, might be their last. Maupassant lost servants and parishioners by the handful. Stanley lived in perpetual exposure. Yet both continued, embodying the very sacrifice they preached. Their presence kept despair at bay, though at times their own hearts must have quaked with fear. Beyond the sermons and prayers, faith also shaped the practical rituals of death. Graves were dug not only in the churchyard, but also in fields and gardens, consecrated by hurried blessings. Families who could not summon a minister still whispered prayers over their dead. Hymns rose softly in kitchens as bodies were carried out through back doors. Faith infused the smallest acts, crosses carved into door lintels, Bibles left open on tables, psalms sung as lullabies to fevered children. And yet, for all its strength, faith exacted a price. It demanded that villagers resist the instinct to flee, that they remain in a valley turned into a tomb. It demanded that they interpret unimaginable suffering as divine will. It demanded that they endure, day after day, without hope of reprieve. The toll was not only measured in graves, but also in the weariness etched upon faces, in the hollowed eyes of survivors who prayed with lips but doubted with hearts. By the year's end, Eyam had become a paradox, a place where faith sustained life even as life crumbled, a place where two clergymen forged a unity born not of doctrine, but of mortality. The toll of faith was immense, but without it, the village would have dissolved into chaos, each family fleeing for itself, carrying plague into the world beyond. It was faith, costly, painful, relentless, that held Eyam together. And so, as winter approached and the plague still smoldered in cottages like an unquenchable fire, the people of Eyam leaned harder on their faith. It was the only anchor in a sea of death, and though it demanded everything, it gave in return the one thing they could not live without: meaning. By the late months of 1666, Eyam had become a village reaped like a field under the scythe of an unseen harvester. What began as isolated funerals had grown into an unending procession of grief, so relentless that even mourning itself was worn thin. Death no longer arrived as an intruder, it dwelled among them, as constant as the air they breathed, and the entire village seemed suspended between two states, half alive, half buried. The scale of loss was staggering. Entire households were wiped out within weeks, cottages left silent save for the buzzing of flies and the smell of decay. Neighbors, themselves weakened by fever, would stumble through lanes to bury the dead, often digging shallow graves hurriedly to prevent further contagion. St. Lawrence's churchyard, once the quiet resting place of generations, overflowed until there was no room for more. Families turned to their own gardens, orchards, and meadows, lowering loved ones into earth that only months earlier had grown food. The familiar landscape of Eyam was being remade into a vast cemetery. Among the most harrowing accounts were those of families such as the Hancock household of Riley Farm, where parents and 6 children succumbed within days, leaving only a lone daughter, Sarah, to dig graves for her entire family. She carved out 7 pits with her bare hands and buried each loved one after another, in a grim ritual of survival. Eyam's harvest that season was not of wheat or barley but of bodies, gathered into the soil by those scarcely strong enough to wield a spade. The rhythm of village life was measured by tolling bells, though eventually even the bells fell silent. The sound of death had become so frequent, so piercing, that Maupassant and Stanley agreed to stop the ringing for fear it would drive the living to madness. Instead, death moved quietly, marked only by whispered prayers and the sight of fresh mounds rising in fields. Silence itself became the village's soundtrack. A silence broken only by coughing, weeping, and the occasional cry of a grieving child. Autumn brought not only disease, but also hunger. Trade with the outside world persisted through boundary stones and vinegar-soaked coins, but supplies were sparse. Many villagers were too weak to tend fields or care for livestock. Sheep wandered untended across hills, crops rotted in soil. Eyam, once sustained by the rhythm of rural life, found itself unable to keep pace with the demands of both labor and loss. Hunger gnawed at survivors, further weakening them for the plague's advance. The psychological toll was no less devastating. Villagers moved through lanes as shadows, avoiding one another for fear of contagion. Doors once open to neighbors were barred shut, cottages becoming islands of sorrow. Fear eroded even the comfort of human touch. A mother might hesitate to embrace a fevered child, knowing that love could mean her own undoing. Children grew up in weeks, forced to dig graves, nurse the sick, and shoulder burdens no childhood should bear. Faith remained, but even it sagged beneath the weight of unrelenting death. And yet, even amid this harvest of despair, flickers of resilience remained. Survivors told of neighbors leaving loaves of bread quietly at doorsteps, of families singing hymns from windows to comfort those passing in the lane, of prayers whispered in unison from gardens when voices could no longer join at Delft. These acts were small, fragile threads binding Eyam's unraveling community. In a time when the harvest was death, such gestures were the seeds of endurance. The outside world watched from a distance, astonished by the village's obedience to quarantine. News of Eyam spread across Derbyshire and beyond, carried by merchants and gentry. Stories of self-sacrifice reached ears in London, where plague had also left devastation. Eyam became a symbol, a living legend of martyrdom, though the villagers themselves knew only the raw immediacy of hunger, fever, and grief. Their sacrifice was praised afar, but within the boundary stones it was only suffering. By the end of that terrible season, Eyam's population had been reduced by more than half. Rows of cottages stood empty, their chimneys cold, their hearths forever extinguished. The living moved through a landscape of absence, each turn of the lane reminding them of friends and kin who no longer walked beside them. Every corner of the village held memory and absence in equal measure. This was the harvest of death, and Eyam bore it with no illusions. The villagers did not expect reprieve, nor did they imagine their story would one day be told as heroism. For them, survival was not about glory but about enduring one more day, one more night, in a world where death ruled. Their sacrifice was lived, not celebrated. And as winter approached, the question lingered like the frost in the air. Would any of them remain when spring returned? As 1666 waned into the bitter cold of 1667, Eyam entered its cruelest season yet. Winter descended not as a reprieve from the plague, but as an accomplice, tightening its grip with icy fingers. Frost settled on cottage roofs, turning the once lively village into a frozen tableau of silence. The lanes that had echoed with funeral processions now lay muffled beneath snow, yet the stillness did not mean safety. Death continued its slow harvest, this time accompanied by the gnaw of hunger and the ache of cold. Winter was merciless to a village already diminished. Survivors found themselves not only grieving, but also struggling for firewood and food. With so many dead, cottages lay abandoned, their hearths extinguished, leaving timbers to creak in the cold wind. Animals had wandered free or perished in fields untended since autumn. Granaries were sparse. What food remained had to be rationed carefully. Villagers bartered what little they had at the boundary stones, exchanging vinegar-washed coins for bread or grain left by neighboring communities. But supplies were often late, sometimes insufficient, and always uncertain. Hunger became an ever-present companion. The plague itself did not fully relent. Though the fury of summer had passed, winter brought a slower rhythm of infection, fewer, but no less devastating. A cough in the night, a sudden fever, or a swelling beneath the skin were still harbingers of despair. Families who had survived months of isolation found themselves struck anew, their endurance tested once more. Winter offered no comfort. It simply altered the pace of suffering. Isolation weighed heavily on the spirit. The open-air sermons at Delft grew fewer, snow and bitter winds driving worship into whispered prayers behind closed doors. Villagers sang hymns alone by their hearths, their voices thin against the howling wind. The unity forged in summer's sacrifices was strained by solitude, each cottage a private prison of grief and fear. Those who did venture out walked the lanes like wraiths, muffled in cloaks, avoiding touch and eye contact. It was as though the very fabric of community had frozen, waiting for thaw. And yet, even in this winter of shadows, the flickers of resilience endured. Families huddled together beneath shared blankets, reading aloud from Bibles by firelight. Neighbors still found ways to signal care, placing kindling at doorsteps, leaving a portion of their scant food for those weaker still. The rhythm of prayer, even if unspoken, formed an invisible thread that bound them. Faith, stretched thin though it was, still glimmered against despair's encroachment. William Mompesson, his heart hollowed by Catherine's death, nevertheless pressed on in his duty. His sermons, fewer now due to weather and weakness, carried a quieter tone, less fiery than in autumn, more contemplative, urging endurance until spring. Thomas Stanley, equally worn, remained steadfast, his words stern but steady, reminding the villagers that their suffering was not meaningless but part of a larger moral fabric. Both men, though gaunt and shadowed by loss, continued to embody the courage they preached. The winter nights were the hardest. Darkness fell early, and the silence of the lanes deepened until it seemed to swallow sound itself. Survivors lay awake, listening for the cough of a child, the labored breathing of a spouse, fearing that by dawn another grave would need digging. Dreams were haunted by the faces of the dead, and mornings brought only the cold comfort of survival. Eyam, once a village alive with laughter, song, and the bustle of markets, had become a place suspended between worlds, not fully alive, not fully dead. Yet, paradoxically, winter also gave space for reflection. With fields dormant and labor slowed, survivors turned inward, contemplating the meaning of their sacrifice. Some wrote brief notes, prayers, or testaments, scratching words into Bibles or carving initials into beams. Others simply endured in silence, their thoughts known only to God. In those months, Eyam became not only a site of suffering but also a crucible of memory, where the meaning of sacrifice was quietly forged. When the year turned and days lengthened, Eyam remained in shadow. More than half its population was gone. The survivors looked upon their village with hollowed eyes, unsure whether spring would bring life or only reveal more graves beneath the thawing earth. Yet, somehow they endured. The winter had not broken them, though it had come close. They had carried their suffering through the darkest season, and in doing so, they kept the flame of sacrifice alive. The winter of shadows had passed, but the shadow itself remained, etched forever into the memory of those who survived. Eyam would never again be the same village it once was. When at last the plague's fury ebbed, it did not announce its retreat with trumpet or sunrise. It thinned like mist, leaving damp chill in the shape of what it had touched. In Eyam, the first sign of change was not joy but the absence of the bell's imagined toll, the way hands paused on door latches and found no fresh cries in the lane, the way a shovel leaned against a cottage wall and was not needed that day. The village had endured the harvest of death and the winter of shadows, and now a quieter task began, the slow, halting labor of being alive among absences. Survivors stepped into the lanes as if into a room where a great quarrel had ended, not daring to speak for fear of waking it again. The boundaries still held, if only by habit. No edict had been lifted, no formal word had declared safety. People learned the new season by the nervous rhythm of their own bodies, by the ebb of funerals and the rare stir of laughter that rose and then faltered, surprised at the sound of itself. The burden that remained was heavier than hunger and as invisible as contagion. It was made of grief, tallying each empty chair, each shutter that would never be opened from within again. It was made of work, because fields lay ragged, animals had wandered, and stores were spent. It was made of memory and of guilt. Those who had survived did not feel chosen so much as spared, and the sparing felt arbitrary. A mother who had nursed 3 children to their graves lived to see spring. A young man who had avoided every sickbed and said every careful prayer succumbed late in the season. In such a world, reason snapped like threads. The survivors bore what could not be explained by doctrine or prudence. Why this life and not that? Why this cottage and not the one next door? Their faith, which had held the line through quarantine, now faced a gentler but more insoluble trial. What to do with a mercy that did not feel like mercy at all? Reentry began at the edges, as most reentries do. The boundary stones, moss-damp and severe, still circled the village like a rosary laid upon a wound. For months they had served as altars where vinegar purified coins and neighbors from beyond left loaves, grain, meat, and sometimes a scrap of linen folded with more care than its price could warrant. Now, tentative figures approached those stones and stood longer. Voices called across the distance and stayed to speak rather than only to barter. A local squire sent word that the surrounding parishes had marked Eyam's sacrifice. They would continue to supply seed for spring planting and tools to replace those broken by disuse. This kindness, born of admiration as much as pity, fell softly. It could not fill an empty bed, but it could put a shoulder to the plow of tomorrow. Within, the village took stock. The parish register, where Mompesson had inked names all year with a hand grown older than his face, now became a ledger of the living. Cottages were counted. Keys were gathered for doors that no one would unlock again. Livestock were rounded from hillsides and marked anew. The most bewildering arithmetic belonged to inheritance. Households had been scythed at odd angles. In some, only a child remained. In others, a widow with no kin. In a few, an elderly laborer whose heirs lay under fieldstone. Land, tools, and obligations had to be reassigned with both justice and speed, and the cleric who had preached sacrifice now turned to the quieter justice of parchment and witness, trying to stitch a workable village from frayed lines of descent. In this, he leaned on Thomas Stanley, whose severity in moral matters translated now into steady hands with disputes. When neighbors argued over a strip of pasture, a cow, a borrowed cart returned in worse repair than it left, these two men, so unlike in creed and so aligned in duty, quieted tempers and redirected eyes toward the coming sowing. Some repairs were possible by craft. Thatch could be patched. Fences could be mended. The forge could be heated, and iron could be coerced back into hinges and hoops. But other repairs had no tools. Children without parents learned to sleep through a house's new echoes. The newly solitary learned the tyranny of silence in rooms meant for two. There were cottages the village could not afford to abandon but could not yet bear to rein habit. In such places, neighbors left a loaf on the sill for no one and swept the threshold as if for a guest who might return. Rituals arose, homely, improvised, to hold loss at bay. A psalm sung each evening at the same corner where a father once paused to ease his back. A habit of touching the lintel with 2 fingers before stepping in. A candle lit on the anniversary of a last conversation whose date no one could agree upon exactly. Survivor's guilt, that slow salt, did not move on a timetable. It stung in unremarkable moments. The taste of honey after months of scarcity. The relief of sun on a stoop. A burst of ordinary laughter that felt like betrayal. Those who had done the most, who had nursed and dug and carried, often suffered the sharpest doubts. Had an extra hour of vigilance saved or doomed anyone? Had a prayer neglected tipped some balance? There were no answers Mompesson could give that would satisfy the arithmetic of love, and he learned to offer presents instead of proofs, walking the lanes not as judge or prophet, but as a man who had buried his wife and still kept breathing. In this, the village took another lesson from its own story. They had chosen for others without guarantee. They would now live without guarantee, day by day, without pretending they could redeem every hurt. When at last the boundary loosened, it loosened by increments. A miller from a neighboring parish entered the valley to assess the wheel and its stones. A mason came to look at a wall that sagged like a tired shoulder. A cousin arrived to take in 2 orphans whose only map of the world had been the 4 fields around Eyam. Each crossing was an act of respect as much as practicality, for the village's roundabout now told the story of Eyam as one tells a saint's passion, haltingly, with eyes lowered, grateful to have been spared the same test. There was, inevitably, suspicion in a few quarters, fear that embers of plague still glowed in shuttered rooms, that a handclasp might claim delayed revenge. But the quarantine's discipline had not only saved others from Eyam, it had instructed them. Visitors kept distance without insult. Gifts were left with a bow. A season of wary kindness taught trust again like a child learning to walk. Spring did what spring has always done. It set about its business with a stubborn indifference to human timetables. Hawthorn foamed in hedges, lambs scattered like punctuation across the hills, and soil accepted seed as if the last year had been nothing more than winter by another name. The miracle was not that nature remembered how to proceed, but that people did. Shoulders learned the weight of plow and churn again. Hands learned the sequence of bread, grain to mill to dough to oven. In cottages where laughter had become suspect, someone risked a song at the end of a day and found the sound did not summon calamity. Work made a scaffolding for the mind. Neighbors labored side by side more willingly than they had before the plague, slower to begrudge and quicker to lend. Loss had turned avarice into a luxury none could afford. When the plague struck Eyam, it tested not only the resilience of bodies but the tensile strength of belief. For the people of 17th century England, faith was the air they breathed, shaping their explanations of illness, death, and survival. The village of Eyam, hemmed in by stone walls and green hills, became more than a community under siege. It became a crucible where every doctrine was tried in fire. When the quarantine began, villagers leaned hard upon the words of William Mompesson, the Anglican rector, and Thomas Stanley, the ejected Puritan minister. Together, these two unlikely shepherds braided different strands of theology into a rope that held their flock steady. But the longer the plague persisted, the more it pried into private chambers of faith where no sermon could follow. For many, the plague was seen as God's judgment, an affliction upon sin or pride. To interpret the disease otherwise was to stand against centuries of scripture and tradition. Each new grave seemed to confirm this suspicion. Mothers whispered psalms of lament as they wrapped their children in shrouds, half in sorrow and half in penance. Yet if judgment was the cause, why did the righteous perish as swiftly as the profane? Why did the faithful minister's own wife, Catherine Mompesson, succumb while some who rarely darkened the church door survived? These contradictions gnawed at belief like mice in the granary. The neat economy of sin and punishment unraveled under the weight of so much arbitrary loss. In those long months, prayers shifted in tone. At first they were cries for deliverance, petitions that God would lift his hand if only the village would repent. As time passed and the pestilence remained, prayers turned quieter, humbler, almost transactional. If not deliverance, then strength. If not strength, then endurance. A woman might pray less for her son's survival than for the courage to dig his grave with steady hands. In this way, faith changed shape, shrinking from cosmic explanations to daily sustenance, a hearth fire rather than a lightning bolt. The two ministers mirrored this transformation. Mompesson, educated in Cambridge theology, initially thundered about providence, about the high honor of sacrifice and the eternal crown laid up for martyrs. But after Catherine's death, his sermons grew softer, infused with the timbre of a man who had walked through the same valley as his listeners. He spoke less about judgment and more about companionship, about the Christ who wept at Lazarus' tomb, about a God who bore wounds. His words no longer attempted to justify each loss, but to name it, honor it, and carry it to the altar of memory. Stanley, the Puritan whose conscience had cost him his pulpit, preached in cottages and fields, away from the church he was barred from by law. He did not speak of crowns or martyrdom. He spoke instead of covenant, of promises written not in survival rates, but in steadfastness. For Stanley, Eyam's quarantine was evidence that ordinary villagers could live out covenant faithfulness by loving neighbor more than self. In his vision, holiness was measured not in immunity, but in obedience. He reminded the living that their sacrifice preserved countless lives in the shires beyond, that their suffering was not meaningless but woven into a larger fabric of mercy. Even so, doubts flowered in the shadows. Some villagers muttered that their prayers fell against a brass heaven. Others feared they had been abandoned altogether. A few wondered if the plague was not divine punishment but mere chance, a radical and terrifying thought in an age that explained little without God. These whispers did not always find voice, but they showed in weary eyes and the sudden reluctance to attend worship. The ministers answered not with threats, but with presence, walking lanes, speaking softly, bearing witness to their own griefs. In this pastoral labor, belief was not argued but modeled, a man kneeling in his own ruined garden, still lifting hands to heaven. Faith did not vanish in Eyam, it transfigured. It became less about answers and more about endurance, less about logic and more about love. Families sang hymns at graves not because they solved anything, but because the act of singing together steadied trembling hearts. Children learned prayers that were half lullaby, half lament, words meant to comfort in the night rather than to persuade the heavens. Women stitched scripture verses into cloth to carry as talismans, not as magic, but as reminders that memory itself was a form of resistance. By the time the plague waned, Eyam's faith had been burned down to its core and remade. It was leaner, less ornate, stripped of pretension. It did not promise safety, it promised presence. Survivors emerged not with triumphalist boasts of divine favor, but with scarred humility. Their God was not one who shielded them from all harm, but one who walked with them into the furnace and back again. This transformation, though invisible to neighboring parishes, became Eyam's deepest legacy. For the villagers, faith was no longer a fragile edifice toppled by the storm, but a weather-worn stone, enduring, plain, and immovable. In their prayers, in their hymns, in the very act of staying within their walls to save strangers, they had discovered that belief, when refined by fire, becomes less a creed to be spoken and more a life to be lived. By the second year of the plague's assault, Eyam had become a village of graves. The churchyard could no longer contain the toll, and so burials spread outward into fields, gardens, and hedgerows. Everywhere one walked, the earth bore witness, freshly turned soil, simple wooden crosses, or stones carved with trembling hands. The quiet graves stood as mute sentinels of a covenant. The villagers vowed to stay within their bounds, even unto death. Silence itself became part of the ritual. There were no long processions, no choirs of mourning. The dead were carried at dusk or dawn, often by surviving family alone, to avoid spreading contagion. Words of farewell were brief, whispered into the wind, sometimes with a minister present, more often without. A Bible verse might be murmured, or a psalm sung with a thin, breaking voice. Then the body was laid down and the soil returned, quick and heavy, leaving the living to trudge home under the shadow of another absence. These burials changed the landscape of Eyam. Cottages stood beside improvised graves, so that gardens once filled with herbs and flowers now held shrouded bodies. Children, who should have played among hedges and sheep, instead grew up passing daily by the markers of their siblings' resting places. A patch of earth once tilled for vegetables became the final bed for an entire household. Fields and woods bore the outlines of grief, so that the geography of Eyam was remade in sorrow. The village itself was turning into a map of sacrifice. The task of digging graves fell to whoever still lived. A father might lower his son, then collapse into the earth himself days later. A daughter might bury her mother with hands too small for the spade. In some instances, neighbors quietly took on the task for households too depleted to manage. It was common for a survivor to return from burial and find no strength to cook or speak, simply sitting in silence before a fire until the embers went out. The act of digging became its own prayer, a ritual of service when words failed, a final testimony that even in death, love endured. Amidst the proliferation of graves, one stood out, Riley's Stones, where the Hancock family of Riley House lay together. In a single week, mother, father, and 6 children succumbed, leaving only a lone survivor, a son who buried them all with his own hands. That patch of ground, marked with stones still visible centuries later, became a symbol of Eyam's agony and its devotion. Each visitor to that place saw distilled the scale of loss, the entire weight of a family extinguished, save for one trembling flame. Yet these quiet graves also bore another meaning. They testified to the resolve of Eyam's quarantine. By burying their dead near their homes rather than transporting them beyond the village, the people prevented contagion from spreading outward. Each grave was not just a place of mourning, but also a line of defense. The land itself absorbed both their sorrow and their sacrifice. The soil of Eyam, in this sense, became consecrated ground, not because priests declared it so, but because love and loss seeped into it with every burial. As months passed, the graves multiplied to the point where villagers could no longer count them. The tally of the dead reached into the hundreds, and yet each burial still demanded its ritual of endurance. People spoke of walking through Eyam as if walking through a vast open-air cemetery, where each turn revealed another silent mound. The sound of spades striking earth was as common as church bells had once been. And in the midst of grief, faith infused the quiet graves with meaning. Ministers reminded survivors that the earth would one day yield to resurrection, that those buried in haste would yet rise in glory. Families inscribed initials on stones, knowing their loved ones' names were etched in heaven even if forgotten by men. The graves, while silent, spoke of hope beyond the plague's reach. To outsiders, they might have seemed only marks of devastation, but within Eyam, they became markers of courage, the proof that the village had chosen to bear the cost of saving others. Centuries later, visitors would walk those same lanes, pausing at stones darkened with moss, reading faint inscriptions. They would marvel at the scale of loss and whisper reverent words about sacrifice. But for Eyam's survivors, those graves were not relics. They were wounds that never fully healed. Each stone was a memory pressed into the earth, a reminder of laughter stilled, of voices silenced. The quiet graves, scattered like constellations across the village, became Eyam's true monument. No grand obelisk, no triumphal inscription, only earth heaped over the dead and stones laid by trembling hands. Yet in their very simplicity, they carried a weight that no monument of marble could match. They told the story of love enduring through plague, of sacrifice etched into soil, of ordinary villagers who turned their own land into holy ground for the sake of strangers beyond their hills. When the last chill of plague finally receded, Eyam emerged into a silence deeper than the silence of death. It was the silence of survival, heavy and complicated, where joy at being alive mingled with grief so vast that it resisted words. For those who endured, life did not return to what it had been. It staggered forward under the unbearable weight of memory. Survival was not an unmitigated blessing. It was both gift and burden, a constant reminder of the faces now absent, of the laughter that no longer echoed through cottage walls. The survivors numbered scarcely a third of the village. Each one bore scars invisible yet profound. Some had lost entire families, parents, children, siblings, left as solitary remnants of once lively households. Others carried the strange guilt of having been spared when the pious, the kind, and the strong had perished. This survivor's guilt, though unnamed in their time, was written in their weary eyes. A widow who had buried 6 children might ask why her own breath still came each morning. A shepherd who had watched his neighbors waste away might question why his hands still tightened the wool of living sheep. These thoughts lingered like shadows at the edge of every task. Memory seeped into the rhythms of the village. The very fields reminded them. Here a family was buried. There a child's grave broke the grass. The act of walking through Eyam meant walking among ghosts. Harvesting grain was not simply tending crops, but laboring beside the dead who had once sung during harvest feasts. Drawing water from the well was a reminder of hands that had touched the same bucket before falling cold. Every ordinary motion of life became a brush against remembrance. Faith softened the edges, but did not erase the weight. Maupassant, who had lost his beloved Catherine, preached not of triumph, but of endurance. He spoke of heaven as a gathering place where the broken circle of families would be made whole again. Stanley, the Puritan minister, counseled his flock that remembrance was itself a holy duty, that to carry the names of the lost was to bear witness to their sacrifice. Together, they nurtured a theology of memory, that survival was not a random sparing but a vocation, a calling to live in a way that honored those who had fallen. This duty manifested in small acts. Survivors tended graves as carefully as they tended gardens. They retold stories of the dead by candlelight, so children who had been too young to remember would grow up knowing names and faces. They sang psalms not just for themselves, but as though lending voices to those who could no longer sing. Life in Eyam became a dialogue between the living and the dead, stitched together by remembrance. Yet remembrance also brought strain. Some found it unbearable to dwell among so many graves. A few left Eyam altogether, seeking to start new lives in distant villages where the land did not speak so insistently of loss. But for those who remained, memory was inescapable. It settled into stone walls, into the grain of wooden doors, into the hush of evenings when fires burned low. The weight of memory was not something to be put down. it was woven into the fabric of life. Over time, memory transformed from a burden into a legacy. What had begun as raw grief became a narrative of sacrifice that villagers passed down as a kind of inheritance. They told children that Eyam's suffering had spared countless others, that their graves were not merely markers of death, but testimonies of love stronger than fear. The story began to lift, slowly, from individual anguish into collective pride. Memory still hurt, but it also inspired. It became a shield against despair and a seed of meaning in fields once soaked with tears. For centuries to come, the weight of memory would continue to press on Eyam, shaping its identity. Visitors from other towns would walk among its stones, astonished by the scale of loss. The villagers would tell them not only of the plague, but of the choice to stay, to bear, to sacrifice. In this way, memory transcended private grief to become communal witness. It transformed Eyam from a forgotten hamlet into a parable of courage known across England and beyond. But in the immediate aftermath, for those who had survived, memory was not a polished story. It was raw and jagged. It lived in empty chairs, in cradles that no longer rocked, in gardens where weeds grew over graves. It was a weight they carried daily, sometimes with strength, sometimes with trembling, but always with fidelity. They could not forget, and in truth, they did not want to. For to forget would have been to abandon those who had given their lives in love. The survivors of Eyam walked forward with bent shoulders but unbroken hearts, bearing a memory heavy as stone yet luminous as faith. In that tension, between grief and pride, between wound and witness, they forged a legacy that would outlast them all. When the final frost of plague had lifted and Eyam's quarantine dissolved, the world beyond its hills discovered a story both astonishing and sobering. Word spread first to neighboring villages, carried by farmers, traders, and clergy who had waited anxiously for signs that Eyam's ordeal was over. They had wondered for months, sometimes years, if the little settlement was utterly extinguished or if anyone remained alive within. The sight of weary but living villagers stepping beyond their self-imposed borders was, to outsiders, nothing less than miraculous. The story of Eyam's self-quarantine moved swiftly, rippling across Derbyshire and then into broader England. Neighboring communities had feared contagion, but now their fears gave way to reverence. Tales were told in marketplaces and churches of a people who, faced with certain death, chose to stay in their homes rather than unleash the plague upon their neighbors. Farmers spoke of Eyam as a place of saints. Traders carried the story along roads toward London. Soon, ministers in far-off parishes invoked Eyam as an example of Christian sacrifice, a parable to remind congregations that love demanded not only prayer, but also courage and action. To the world beyond the walls, Eyam became a symbol of moral fortitude. Where other towns had fled in panic or turned violently upon strangers, Eyam had done neither. Instead, it embraced the hardest path, bearing its burden alone. Outsiders marveled at the discipline and piety of a village that had denied itself the instinct of self-preservation for the sake of lives unseen. Greater love hath no man than this, preachers intoned, that a man laid down his life for his friends. Eyam had laid down the lives of hundreds not just for friends, but for strangers beyond its hills. Yet not all response was reverent. Some questioned whether Eyam's self-isolation had been folly, whether the villagers had courted unnecessary suffering when some might have escaped. Others, less charitable, whispered that perhaps the plague itself was God's judgment, and Eyam's fate a divine decree. But these voices were soon drowned out by the sheer weight of the story. For every critic, there were dozens who saw in Eyam a reflection of their highest ideals: loyalty, courage, sacrifice. In London, where the plague had claimed tens of thousands, the story of Eyam resonated deeply. Accounts of whole neighborhoods emptied and corpses carted through the streets contrasted sharply with the image of a small rural village quietly bearing its sorrow and dignity. Londoners had seen the worst of humanity in the plague years: panic, selfishness, violence. But Eyam's example offered something redemptive. Writers recorded the tale in pamphlets, and eventually historians began to enshrine it in chronicles. Thus, the narrative of Eyam moved from rumor to moral lesson, embedded in the cultural memory of England. The world beyond also played a role, in Eyam's survival. Nearby villages had supplied food, leaving provisions on boundary stones where Eyam's inhabitants collected them in exchange for coins washed in vinegar. This detail fascinated outsiders. Even in quarantine, trade persisted, carefully negotiated with remarkable trust on both sides. The image of silver coins submerged in vinegar became emblematic, an everyday act transformed into a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. For those beyond Eyam, the village became both inspiration and warning. Its story testified to the price of disease, but also to the possibility of turning calamity into witness. Ministers preached of Eyam's sacrifice to urge their flocks toward faithfulness in adversity. Physicians, though limited in understanding, studied Eyam's methods of isolation, noting how containment slowed contagion. Politicians cited the story in discussions about civic responsibility. A village of fewer than 1,000 souls had, by its suffering, spoken to an entire nation. And yet, for all the admiration, the villagers who remained often felt the gap between how the world perceived them and what they themselves carried. Outsiders praised their sacrifice. Survivors remembered empty houses, graves beside cottages, and nights filled with weeping. Outsiders celebrated Eyam's courage. Survivors lived with the loneliness of being one of the few left standing in a village once full of life. To the world, Eyam was legend. To those who endured, it was scar tissue. Over time, however, the tale and the memory began to converge. Survivors, though heavy with grief, recognized that their suffering had not been in vain. They saw neighboring towns spared devastation and realized their sacrifice had been the wall that held the plague at bay. The story they carried in their hearts was one of unbearable cost, but as it echoed beyond their valley, it transformed into a narrative of hope for others. The world beyond Eyam's walls gave meaning to what otherwise might have been seen as senseless tragedy. The recognition, the reverence, the retelling of their story all served to weave Eyam into the broader fabric of English history. From that moment forward, Eyam was no longer merely a village. It was a symbol, a touchstone, a testament. The story of Eyam did not end with the lifting of quarantine, nor even with the lives of those who survived. It lived on, a quiet flame carried across centuries, illuminating not only the village itself, but the wider human struggle with disease, fear, and communal responsibility. In many ways, the greatest legacy of Eyam was not the tragedy of its loss, but the testimony of its choice. That choice, the decision to embrace self-quarantine, transformed a small Derbyshire hamlet into a parable told and retold in pulpits, in history books, and eventually in classrooms across the world. In the years immediately following the plague, Eyam's story was preserved orally, passed down in psalms, sermons, and the daily retelling of grief-tinged memories. Families who had survived became stewards of memory. Children grew up knowing the names of neighbors who had died long before they could remember them. To forget was considered dishonor. To remember was a sacred duty. The stone cottages and churchyard graves became living monuments, reminders that the soil itself was consecrated by sacrifice. As England moved forward into the Enlightenment and beyond, Eyam's narrative was increasingly framed as both moral and scientific. Historians chronicled it as a remarkable act of civic duty. Clergy held it up as an example of Christian love. Physicians, reflecting on the village's containment, began to understand how isolation slowed contagion, a lesson that would echo through later outbreaks of smallpox, cholera, and influenza. Eyam had, through bitter cost, offered the world a lesson in epidemiology long before the word itself entered common use. The centuries layered new meaning upon the old. In the 19th century, during the Romantic movement, poets and writers visited Eyam and were struck by the atmosphere of sacred stillness that clung to its fields and church. They wrote of it as a place where tragedy and nobility intertwined, where the ghosts of the past whispered lessons of love and endurance. The Victorians, with their fascination for death and mourning, found in Eyam a perfect symbol, a community that had turned suffering into sanctity. In the 20th century, as the world endured pandemics of Spanish flu and later the emergence of HIV/AIDS, Eyam's name resurfaced in discussions of public health. Scholars revisited the village not merely as a footnote in English history, but as a case study in the ethics of contagion. Here was an early example of communal sacrifice for the greater good, a reminder that the struggles of modernity had ancient echoes. Eyam's story offered perspective, that humanity's battle with disease was as much moral as medical. The 21st century brought Eyam's legacy into sharper focus once more. In times of global pandemics, the name Eyam reappeared in articles, lectures, and reflections. People drew strength from its example, reminding one another that the villagers of 1665, with far less knowledge and far fewer resources, had faced their plague with courage and unity. Eyam became a mirror in which modern societies could examine their own choices, fears, and responsibilities. The village's story asked anew, what will you do for others when the shadow of death falls across your threshold? For Eyam itself, the legacy is tangible. Visitors walk its streets, trace the moss-covered stones of its cottages, and kneel before the graves of those who gave their lives. The Church of St. Lawrence still stands, its bells ringing not only for worship, but as a call to remembrance. Plaques mark the boundary stones where coins soaked in vinegar were exchanged for food, transforming an ordinary act of barter into an enduring emblem of trust and ingenuity. Eyam's fields and lanes are not only English countryside. They are hallowed ground, carrying stories etched deeper than the roots of trees. But perhaps the truest legacy of Eyam lies not in monuments or memorials, but in the enduring idea that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary peril, can rise to extraordinary heights. The villagers of Eyam were not kings, generals, or saints canonized by Rome. They were shepherds, miners, seamstresses, and farmers, common folk whose names history might have forgotten had they chosen differently. Instead, by their collective act of sacrifice, they inscribed their memory into the conscience of the world. The story of Eyam endures because it speaks not only to death, but to life. Life defined by love strong enough to embrace suffering for the sake of others. It is a story of courage that outlasted fear, of community that transcended self, of memory that grew into legacy. In every generation that retells it, Eyam lives again, reminding us that the human spirit is capable of bearing unbearable burdens when it does so in the service of love. The village of Eyam remains more than a story about death. It is a meditation on life, choice, and the fragile threads that bind communities together. When faced with plague, the villagers could have fled, abandoning neighbors and spreading death through the surrounding valleys. Instead, they paused, looked inward, and chose the path of sacrifice. That decision, quiet, unspectacular, and made without hope of glory, transformed Eyam into a moral compass for centuries to come. History is filled with grand gestures by kings and generals, but Eyam's significance rests in its ordinariness. These were not leaders of empires or men of renown. They were miners, shepherds, widows, and children. Their lives were small in scale, but vast in meaning, because they proved that the greatest acts of courage often happen in the smallest places. Eyam teaches that heroism does not always appear on battlefields or in halls of power. Sometimes it blossoms in cottages where neighbors agree, in unison, to endure together what they could not bear alone. The lesson of Eyam echoes across centuries into our own age. Pandemics did not end in the 17th century. Each new outbreak forces societies to wrestle with the same questions Eyam faced. How much of ourselves are we willing to surrender for the safety of others? What does solidarity demand of us when fear whispers that survival lies in isolation, selfishness, or denial? Eyam answers with a voice shaped by suffering but resonant with dignity. Love is not a sentiment but a choice, made in the valley of shadows, with consequences that ripple outward. Modern science has given us tools, vaccines, antibiotics, systems of quarantine and treatment, that the villagers of Eyam could not have dreamed of. Yet technology alone cannot shield us from the moral demands of crisis. We remain, as they were, bound together by invisible ties. Their story reveals that survival is not merely about the individual, but about the community, and that true strength is measured not by escape, but by endurance. The legacy of Eyam lies not only in the numbers, 700 lives lost, 90 surviving, but in the message their suffering carried forward. They remind us that life has value beyond the self, that sometimes the only way to protect the future is to embrace loss in the present. Their graves stand as quiet teachers, urging us to remember that every choice carries weight, and that even the humblest community can speak to the world when it chooses compassion over fear. In the end, Eyam's self-quarantine is a parable of human resilience. It reminds us that tragedy can birth meaning, that sacrifice can preserve life, and that love, when tested, can outlast despair. To walk through Eyam today is to feel the presence of those who chose to stay, their silence speaking louder than sermons. They did not know their story would endure, yet it has, offering each new generation a mirror in which to examine its own courage. Perhaps this is Eyam's greatest gift, a reminder that the measure of a people is not found in their prosperity, but in their willingness to suffer for the sake of others. In a world where crises return with unyielding regularity, the villagers of Eyam still whisper across time, calling us to remember that the human spirit is capable of sacrifice profound enough to protect not only a valley, but the very idea of humanity itself. The village of Eyam remains more than a story about death. It is a meditation on life, choice, and the fragile threads that bind communities together. When faced with plague, the villagers could have fled, abandoning neighbors and spreading death through the surrounding valleys. Instead, they paused, looked inward, and chose the path of sacrifice. That decision,